I think most people now realise that we really are facing a climate emergency, and governments, businesses, and actually all of us as individuals, we all need to do our bit to reduce carbon emissions. And of course, one thing that governments, businesses, and all of us have to do every day is pay each other. Now, the carbon impact of an individual transaction might not be that big, but when there are over 1 trillion of them per year, and when that's continuing to grow, then you have to ask the question, how can we make those payments greener? Let's find out in this episode of Navigating Digital Payments.
Welcome to the Navigating Digital Payments podcast, brought to you by Worldline, bringing you the latest innovations, trends, and predictions about the future of payments.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Navigating Digital Payments podcast. I'm David Daly. I look after the Discovery Hub here at Worldline, and I'm really delighted to be joined by two people today to discuss this very important subject of how we can make payments greener. We have Patrice Geoffrand, who is a professor of economics at the University of Paris Dauphine. Patrice, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, David. Nice to be with you both.
Really great to have you on board. And we are also joined by Sébastien Mandron, who is the CSR officer at Worldline. Sébastien, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, David. Happy to be with you today.
Great to have you here too. And the reason it's so exciting to have you both on the podcast is that recently Worldline sponsored a study that was prepared by Patrice, which analysed the carbon impact of payments in Belgium and reached some interesting conclusions, I think, for how that carbon impact can be reduced. And I guess we'll put a download link in the episode description for anyone who would like to read it and check out all the information in there. So, as I said in the introduction, in this episode, I'd really like to understand what you think we can do as an industry to reduce the carbon impact of payments. Also really interested in how the carbon impact of digital payments compares to cash. And also fascinated actually to understand from you, what are some of the main drivers behind the carbon impact of a digital payment? What are the really big contributors and what are some of the smaller contributors? But before we come on to all of that, maybe I can ask you both a little bit about why and how you conducted this study. So, Sébastien, I said earlier, I think everyone appreciates the need to fight climate change, but maybe I can ask you specifically, why did Worldline feel it was important to sponsor this study?
I think the main point is coming that Worldline is engaged for years on the climate issues. And as Worldline is providing, in fact, a solution to perform digital payment transaction, the question came, which is to say, okay, what is just our impact in that long chain? Because we were expecting, unfortunately, that the digital part is the biggest one, okay? But we don't know what was the magnitude of it, okay? So that's the reason why we say it's the opportunity to make a life cycle analysis of the digital payment transaction, just to know what is our part in this story between the plastic credit card, the payment terminal, the data center that we run, and this receipt, okay? Just to measure the level of investment we have to do just to cut those CO2 emissions and to be aligned with net zero trajectory. So that was the starting point.
And already there, Sébastien, you've mentioned an important concept, which I guess not everyone might be familiar with, which was this idea of a life cycle assessment. Because as you say, with payments, but it probably applies to any process, there's the parts within Worldline's control, but actually there's a long chain of activities, let's say, with a payment, each of which makes a potential contribution. So maybe that leads nicely onto a question to you, Patrice. I mean, people might think it's really easy to just add up a few numbers and come up with the carbon impact of a payment. But can you share a little bit about some of the complexities of doing a life cycle assessment and the approach you took?
Yeah, obviously it's complex because first of all, up to now, we had few information as regard that footprint. There was many study, most of them provided by central banks, as to determine the environmental impact of banknotes and coins. But from my point of view, it was not sufficient because our daily experience is that we use a diversity of methods to pay and not only with cash. And from my point of view, what is really interesting in the analysis commissioned by Worldline is that it will permit to compare the footprint of different way to organize payment. As a client user in our daily experience, once again, we observe that some parts of that chain value that David you have mentioned is visible. The bank card, the terminal of payment, or a smartphone and things like that. But the whole chain value is much more complex because it involves telecommunication network, data center, and so and so. And the idea with that analysis was both to have a global perception of the life cycle and its impact in environmental terms of different methods of payments, and moreover to be able to compare it.
And one thing that I thought was particularly interesting, actually, when I was reading the study, is how, to take as an example, you might logically think, well, if you get rid of the plastic card and you just use a virtual card in an Apple Pay wallet or Google Pay, then you eliminate that part of the carbon impact. But then, of course, you have to actually allow for some of the carbon footprint of the phone or the device that's holding the virtual card. So it's not so simple. And of course, with a phone, I mean, I use my phone for lots of things, not only for making payments. So payments is a small part, I guess, of what I use my phone for. So can you say a little bit more, Patrice, about how you took those factors into account when you're looking at a device or something that is not dedicated just to making the payment?
Yeah, it was one of the complex things because first of all, as you said, the bank card is made of plastic. We know that, and plastic is not that good. And then from that point of view, even with effort of recycling, it's better in the future not to use a card anymore. And the most obvious way to substitute in that case is to have a kind of, I don't know how to say that, of universal use of our smartphone. But the difficulty, David, and all of us and the people that listen to us know that perfectly, we use that kind of smartphone for many, many things. And the idea with that analysis was to be able to devote one part of the footprint of our smartphone to one payment. And I will not enter into complex detail, but basically the idea was to say, well, it's first of all, we need to be conservative because the idea is to, at the end of the day, to be able with that analysis to clarify some order of magnitude. And from that point of view, what we observe is that considering the lifetime of bank card and considering the diversity of the thing that we do with smartphone, in fact, removing the card is really, really valuable in terms of reduction of carbon footprint of payment. We will maybe provide some more detail a bit later in the discussion.
So that's really interesting. So you have to attribute part of the carbon footprint of the device to the payment, but in this case you find that was actually still better than having a plastic card. Okay, that's really interesting. You mentioned, we can cover some of these things in more detail, so perhaps we come on to some of the conclusions in the report. So maybe, Sebastian, I can ask you first, in this study, what did we find were some of the biggest contributors to the carbon impact of a digital payment?
If we take just the numbers, what is obvious is that the key contributor for CO2 emission, it is the paper receipt, especially as one is printed for the merchant as a backup, and one, in fact, to the cardholder. Okay, just more than 40%. So it's quite obvious, quite clear. If we go a little bit further, in fact, what is highlighted in that study, compared to what we initially planned, we were expecting a big CO2 emission, in fact, in the data center. Definitively is not the point. 4%. Okay, on this study is just highlighting that all the physical devices or material that are in this process, which is the paper receipt I just mentioned, the card or the terminal, is the biggest part. Okay, so definitively, what is highlighted here is that the data center that is consolidating, in fact, all the transaction that is mutualized, that has a very lifespan, in fact, this one is concentrating, in fact, the minimum of CO2 emission compared to the others.
I think it is a surprising result. I think had I not read the results of the study, I would have thought digital payments, it must be the servers in the data centers that are impacting the environment the most. I certainly wouldn't have thought that that's just 4% of the contribution. And as you say, something as simple as a receipt, but printed twice, making up 40% of the carbon impact is a really huge contributing factor. I am interested in how digital payments compare to cash payments. So, Patrice, maybe I can ask you the same question, but for cash. So, what are the big drivers behind the CO2 impact of a cash payment?
Yeah, that question is very sensitive because when we observe the situation all over Europe, people continue to use cash less and less, but it is still in the portfolio of the means that they use in their daily life. And then the idea is not to say, well, we will go in a world without cash. It would be much too soon from my point of view. But this being said, we need to have in mind that most of the footprint of the cash payment is that we need to deal with something which is material, and we need to go to the ATM, and the merchant has to deal with the cash at the end of the process, and so. And this is obvious, I think, for everyone. Once again, in trying to be conservative, in fact, the order of magnitude that is one of the main conclusions of that study is to say that comparing with a payment by card, the footprint of a cash payment is 15 times higher in terms of CO2 emission, 15 times higher. And we need to have that in mind. Because we are familiar with cash, we consider that obviously it has let's say, an historical and cultural value, and maybe that switching to more electronized payment is something that for one part of the population could be less obvious than for other, but we need to have that in mind. The footprint, it's much more massive.
Again, maybe a little bit like the data center point for digital payments. What I realized looking at the study is that if someone asked me and I didn't know, I would probably think it's the production of the coins and the production of the banknotes that's the big CO2 impact. But I guess the point is that gets spread over many transactions, many cash payments. So perhaps that impact's not so great.
Yeah. In fact, we need to go to the ATM and for that mobility, well, depending on the way we go to the ATM, and even if we use our bicycle, we need an energy that has a more or less intense carbon footprint.
Yeah.
This is the reality. And compared to that, and David, you stressed the point just before, well, the efficiency of the other part of the system, which are more or less electronalized, is in terms of both energy consumption and also in terms of carbon footprint much lower.
And I guess as well with just thinking about cash, it's also true that once upon a time, people received their salary in cash in an envelope, and then they went to the shop and paid in cash, and then those shops paid their staff with the same cash. But of course, that's not how the world works now. Most people receive their salary as a digital payment. So if they then want to use the cash, as you say, they have to visit the ATM, and shops are not paying their staff in cash, so they have to get the cash banked at the end of each day, and all of that has, as you say, a transportation cost and a CO2 impact. Now, I did notice, maybe unpicking that even a little bit more, Patrice, that in the report we made some assumptions about the number of transactions, cash transactions per ATM visits, and actually that assumption was quite a significant driver in how cash compares to digital payments. So can you say a little bit more about that, about those assumptions and how that influences the difference?
Yeah, in fact, the answer is obvious because one of the interests that we had to work in cooperation with Worldline was to be able to use real-life data. And with that data, we know that more or less in Belgium, people with one operation at the ATM withdraw 140 euro. And in fact, behind that, the equation is quite simple. The more they make payment with that wall amount, the more they share the initial footprint in terms of CO2 emission due to that operation. Because in reality, whether you withdraw 20 euro or 140 euro, in fact, the footprint is more or less the same. Okay. And then basically one of the final recommendation that we make with that study is to say, well, for people that need to continue to use cash or that prefer using cash, well, it's relevant if people make many payments with the same amount. Okay, as to share with more payment that initial footprint.
So it's more environmentally friendly to make fewer larger withdrawals from the cash machine, because then the CO2 impact of the trip to the cash machine is spread over more transactions.
Yeah, in fact, what is better is not to use cash. This is one of the main conclusions of the study, and it is massive in terms of differences of CO2 emission. But as long as people use cash, and as long as they use ATM to get that cash, well, they need to split it in the maximum amount of payment.
And I guess we've maybe started to touch on this already, but in a minute, I'd really like to go a bit further on what conclusions you reached from this study about the best way to reduce the carbon impact of payments. But first, I do just want to remind people that if they would like to get in contact with the podcast, to propose new topics, give us any feedback, then you can write to us by emailing ndp-podcast@worldline.com. And of course, my usual gentle reminder, if you haven't already, to please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast. That way you never miss an episode. And also, if you haven't already, leave us a rating and a review. So, Sebastian, coming on to some of the main conclusions, perhaps we can divide this up into kind of what merchants can do, what banks can do, and what payment providers like Worldline can do. So, Sebastian, maybe I ask you first, in terms of merchants, what are the main changes they could make that would help reduce the carbon impact of a payment?
So also have stated that the CO2 emission are coming from devices that are not sufficiently used. Okay, definitively for the merchant, it's trigger 2 points. The first one is the ticket receipt that are not used by the people, and that is one per transaction. Definitively, it's a too expensive impact. And more people do not need, in fact, these tickets. Okay, so the first thing to do is definitely to stop to print automatically this ticket. In case there is one person that needs it, can be printed exceptionally, but the mindset should be no need anymore. Okay, no automatic printing of those tickets. People are not needed anymore. Okay, first statement. Second statement, it is this terminal. Okay, this terminal is generating a lot of CO2 emission. What we did not tackle here as currently is that when we speak about payment transaction, everyone has in mind, in fact, the usage. Okay, the electricity consumption. Okay, but what is behind, in fact, the CO2 emission here? It is the manufacturing cost of this terminal. And currently, what we saw is that there is other way, in fact, to make some payments without additional devices. And this is what a phone can do. And that's the reason why for the merchant, they have to ask themselves, okay, do I really need an additional device just to perform my payments? Okay, and here we see on the market that there is other ways to pay with a phone, okay, automatically, and that is not changing the life negatively of the consumer. Okay, what we are stating here is that for the paper receipt, asking the people to not take the receipt, I'm not creating any problem in their life. Same for the payments, meaning that if I ask the people to pay with their phone, okay, directly on another device, I'm not creating an extra cost. I'm not asking them an extra effort. I'm just telling them to change the way they do, okay? And at the end, in some cases, I can create a valuable additional customer experience. For instance, if rather than paying directly at the cash machine, you go, in fact, and have a discussion with the guy selling some books, in fact, in a shop. This guy, in fact, he can provide you more advice or propose you other books. Okay, that means that you strengthen the relation between the merchant and the clients. Okay, and you are able to provide additional services or additional value for the customer. Okay, this is what is highlighted on top of just cutting, in fact, the CO2 emission. There is a way here, in fact, to strengthen the relation between the merchant and the clients to create more value and potentially, in fact, to create more interactions.
So if I understand well what you're saying, the first big saving is in just not printing receipts. And secondly, it's to not have a device for accepting payments in the store that is dedicated to payment acceptance only. But I think what you're also there saying is that actually when we see things like soft POS solutions, which means members of staff can have a device and they can help customers, they can be more mobile around the store, it potentially is better for the environment, but it also delivers then a better customer experience at the store as well.
Yeah, for sure.
And Patrice, now coming on to banks, what are some of the changes banks could make in order to reduce the carbon impact of payments?
In fact, I will echo some of the things that has been said by Sébastien, because in fact, what we have in front of us is an ecosystem, and banks obviously have a specific place in that ecosystem. And then, first of all, they could provide some advices to their client as regard their behavior and their footprint. And I think they should do that maybe much more than this is the case presently. Okay, so this is the first thing, sharing advices, first of all. The second thing they should do is, and most of them are more advanced as regard that second part, is to try to extend the life of card, to extend the life of terminals and all the devices that they are directly in charge of their management. And this is the same idea that the one stressed by Sébastien as regard the merchant. This is the case also for bank, because due to that materiality and due to the fact that the materiality of a bank card relates to the fact that we need to emit CO2 for their production, the more we will use it, the better it will be. And this is a universal rule as regard the climate action for more or less everything. And the last thing they need to promote and to anticipate is the fact that in the near future and as soon as possible, well, the footprint of the transaction could be lowered without card and without a payment terminal. And this is the next step and something that needs to be anticipated, because one of the main conclusions that we obtain with Worldline is the fact that it could be possible to have symbolically a payment whose carbon footprint could be lower than 1 gram of CO2 per payment.
Wow. And I think it's really interesting, isn't it, from both what you've said and Sébastien has said, that with devices, and I include card as a device, the more transactions you use it for and the longer you keep it before it's replaced, the less the environmental impact per transaction is. And it strikes me that it's still not so common, for example, I think, for banks to offer virtual cards only, so to not post out a physical card at all. And I've even seen some cases where they offer a backup card, so you can have one card plus a backup card, which I guess instantly doubles the CO2 impact, essentially, because you're never going to use both cards at the same time to make the same payment. Well, I guess what's surprising is there are some quite simple changes that actually have a big impact in this area. Maybe then finally, Sébastien, looping back to you for what does all of this mean for payment providers like Worldline? What's the way that we can make a contribution to all of this?
So, in fact, I think the main contribution on one of the direct benefits of this study is to make people aware, okay? Because in a context where all of us, we know that we are going to change our standard of living, okay, by not taking the plane, by changing the food, by reviewing our hosting, in fact, what we offer here, in fact, is concrete action that is going to decrease the CO2 emission for nothing. Okay, it's like it's like a free lunch. Okay, this is the big discovery of this study, that we have the capacity, in fact, to change our habit and to get immediate benefit and get without changing anything, without creating extra cost. Okay, so definitively where we are engaged is to promote those good action towards the industry. So it could be a point for the regulators to understand how maybe they can adapt the regulation to ease those transformation. What is obvious in our side is that what we saw is that we already saw people not taking the paper. Okay, we see more and more people not taking the card to make their payment, but just their phone. This is specific to young population, and we see more and more, in fact, merchants stating that they would like to have other way of payment, not using the terminals, because they know that when they have to use the terminals, they need to have a human being, in fact, to use the terminals, and they will prefer that this human being, in fact, is doing something else, providing more value. Okay, so definitively Worldline is positioned currently on that topic because we identified that it is going to contribute a lot, okay, because dividing by 3 CO2 emission from one day to another without any extra cost, it's quite specific. If you like to make such saving in automotive industry, you just need to divide by 3 the weight of the car. So it's not the same magnitude of effort. So that's the reason why we have engaged, in fact, this proposition to share that with regulators, with banks, merchants, and so on, because we are convinced that more and more, in fact, people will catch these new habits that have definitively a very positive impact.
It was a question I was going to ask you, actually, because Patrice mentioned that one of the conclusions is that we could reduce the carbon impact per payment to below 1 gram. And that's a 3-fold reduction, is it, potentially, from what it is currently?
Yeah, this is the order of magnitude, and we have made the calculation that only for Belgium, but the situation could be close to that all over Europe. Only for Belgium and for the transactions that are managed by Worldline, it could represent a reduction of CO2 emission of 2,100 tons of CO2 per year. And in fact, much more if the comparison is not only in reducing the CO2 emission of digital transaction, but if the comparison is with cash payment, it massively contributes to the reduction of CO2 emission. And as stressed by Sébastien, it is key, without, in fact, a real negative impact and without adding constraint, which is unfortunately most of the case what we have to do for travel and things like that.
So if I understand well, for Belgium, it would potentially save 2,100 tons of CO2 emissions.
Yeah, per year. Another way to say that, if we compare not the reduction and the improvement of the efficiency of digital transaction, but if we compare cash transaction, and in that report it means 36 grams per transaction. Okay, it's massive. Well, with the best practices as regard digital transaction, it could represent only 1 gram of CO2. And then you divide by 36, switching from the use of cash, as people usually do, at least in Belgium, to the best way to implement digital transaction.
Wow, so I guess what you're saying is that there's a potential 3 times improvement on digital payments, but if people switch from cash to the improved digital payments where we get rid of the receipt, etc., then there is a 36 times improvement, which is incredible. And I think what's remarkable and worth repeating is that it's an improvement made without negatively impacting the user experience for people, and also with relatively small investment required. So it's an incredible improvement for a relatively low cost. Quite remarkable. So I have to say, it has been brilliant to get to speak to 2 people behind this study who really understand the detail and who can share some of these insights. And I think it's really great to hear that whilst we're fighting this climate emergency, there are some really positive contributions that we can make in the payments industry. So just want to thank you so much for joining us, Patrice. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
And also, Sebastian, great to have you here. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks a lot, David, for the chat.
And that just leaves me, of course, finally to thank our dear listeners for joining us once again today as we navigated digital payments.
Thank you for listening to the Navigating Digital Payments podcast, brought to you by Worldline. Join us next time to learn more about the latest innovations, trends, and predictions for the future of payments.